Institute, and for those of you streaming online, welcome as well. Hopefully you can hear us after a little bit of technical runarounds. But I am Billy Coleman. I'm the associate.
Oh, you need the.
What stick mic?
Oh, here. Oops, here you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Welcome. Is it? This is for the on. It's only for the online audience. It's only for the online audience, and they can hear me. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm Billy Coleman. I'm the associate director of the Kinder Institute, and I'm super excited to be welcoming everyone to the first colloquium we have of this semester. As I do that, it is incumbent upon me somewhat to note that this is not the one and only talk that we have this semester. We have a whole slate of talks coming up, the information for which you can get online. Go to our website, check out all the different talks that are coming up. We have physical flyers about it, so please do check those out. I just want to point out two particular ones. The first being that the next colloquium, the very next one that we have, will be in 3 weeks' time. So same time, same place in 3 weeks. And here, that'll be Caltech Professor of Political Science, Rod Kiewit, who'll be talking about the evolution of public school finance in the antebellum era. And secondly, at the risk of getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, I do want to flag that at the end of this semester we have our biennial Kinder Institute Distinguished Lecture that will be taking place on May 13th, which, if you're counting, is an exam week. Tuesday, May 13th at 6 p.m. in the large and lovely Missouri Theatre, and this will be a lecture featuring NPR Morning Edition host Steve Inskeep, who will be talking about his new book, Differ We Must, How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America. So, big one for the diary there. But of course, our job for now, at least my job, is to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Caitlin Carter. Dr. Carter is an assistant professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. Go Irish, I'm told. She is an expert in not one, but two revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and really an expert in the politics of the Atlantic world writ large. So a topic very close to our hearts here at the Kinder Institute, not least our MA students who are enrolled in an MA on Atlantic history and politics. So they had a nice conversation with her at lunch. We'll continue to hear more about that over the next little while. Dr. Carter earned a BA in history from the University of California, Berkeley, her MA and PhD in history from Princeton University, and after that she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. This year she is currently coming to us from her current post, which is back at Princeton University on a fellowship at the Shelby Coleman Davis Center, where she's developing a new project on the politics of truth in early America. Today, however, we will be hearing about her award-winning first book entitled Democracy in Darkness, Secrecy and Transparency in the Age of Revolutions. It's published by Yale University Press in 2023. The book was awarded the Gilbert Chinard Prize for the History of French-American Relations, received an honorable mention for the Louis Gottschalk Prize for 18th Century Studies, and was a finalist for the Edwards Book Award, recognizing books contributing to our understanding of the practice of democracy and American politics. So it is clearly fortuitous that the author of that book would find their way to the Kinder Institute, right? Dr. Carter is also the author of several scholarly essays, featured and published in the Journal of the Early Republic and French History, and also the author of many articles for public audiences published in an array of different places, including the Washington Post. Caitlin, as some of you might remember, was originally scheduled to kick off our colloquium series last semester. Fate got in the way of that, so I'm especially happy to be able to welcome her here this afternoon, which I invite all of us to do. Welcome.
Thank you all so much for that really generous, warm welcome, and for all coming out this afternoon, this rainy day, to talk about democracy. I am especially grateful to Jay Sexton and Billy for extending the invitation, and to Amber and Karen, who have helped me so much with logistics, especially since I had to move from August because of COVID, so it's still striking us. And thanks for your patience, too, in getting set up. Said I'd make a joke about transparency in the 21st century requires a lot of cords and wires. So anyway, I think that we're good. Okay, so this afternoon, what I want to do is give you a quick overview of my book. And then I want to briefly delve into part of the American case study to talk about that specifically. And then I just want to wrap up by talking about some present-day implications of my research, which are maybe unfortunately many. All right, so as many of you probably know, the masthead of the Washington Post proclaims that democracy dies in darkness. But this common belief obscures the fact that democracy was actually born in darkness. When prominent men from across the newly independent American states descended on Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, no one knew exactly what they were doing here inside the Pennsylvania State House on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. The members of the Constitutional Convention very consciously decided to keep the contents of their meetings secret as they hashed out a new political framework for the United States. One morning that summer, a delegate actually dropped a copy of his notes outside the room. They were picked up, they were handed to George Washington, who was very recognizable. And after the deliberations ended that afternoon, Washington reportedly stood up, threw the papers down on the table, and declared, I am sorry to find that some one member of this body has been so neglectful of the secrets of the convention as to drop in the State House a copy of their proceedings. Now, his frustration was reportedly intensified when he, quote, quitted the room with a dignity so severe that every person seemed alarmed. William Pierce, a delegate from Georgia, recounted approaching the table with some anxiety and anguish after he reached in his own pocket to find his notes were missing. Only when he saw that those notes were in someone else's handwriting and then found his later that night in his room did he breathe a sigh of relief. Now, according to him, no one ever claimed those dropped papers. Whoever it was too ashamed of having dropped them outside. So in my book, I asked why Washington was so concerned with maintaining secrecy and what this can tell us about how he and his colleagues understood the representative process. More importantly, perhaps, I ask what the effect of the framers having met behind closed doors to devise a constitution in the name of the people was. Almost all histories of the Constitutional Convention note that it was held behind closed doors, but they've not fully recognized the significance of this, I think. So in my book, I place procedural decisions like this one front and center to argue that we cannot understand how the framers, or anyone else for that matter, understood representative government without looking at how they actually practiced it in the convention and also in subsequent legislative bodies. All right, so to give you a brief overview, my book is at root about the mismatch between how rhetorically central transparency was to representative democracy at its founding, on the one hand, and the prominent use of secrecy in its practical application, on the other hand. So it traces the origin of claims, like the one found today on top of the Washington Post, to uncover how transparency came to be considered fundamental to representative democracy during the age of revolutions. But in my book, I show how in practice, this belief was at odds with the reality that secrecy was essential to the establishment of representative governments in both the United States and in France. So by foregrounding political practice over discourse and ideology, I argue that despite the rhetorical emphasis on transparency, it was actually the use of secrecy that secured the legitimacy of newly created representative regimes. So commitments to transparency in the governments that came out of the French and American revolutions often resulted in losses of legitimacy and instability. Secrecy essentially allowed for the representative government to gain legitimacy as a democratic form by shielding much of the work of governance from the people who are ostensibly being represented in that process. So the use of secrecy made it possible for elected representatives to take actions that did not always appear to be the most popular, or seem to align with public opinion without losing their legitimacy as voices of the people. Ultimately, in doing this, my book uncovers a paradox at the heart, I think, of modern representative democracy, which is that at its origin, its legitimacy and stability depended upon a degree of secrecy that was simultaneously being deemed anathema to that very type of government. And I think this is, I argue in my book, I think this is really important if we want to understand how representative democracy came to be and gained legitimacy in the 18th century and going forward. So my book takes off in doing this from a recent revival of scholarship on the age of revolutions to offer a transatlantic history of political practice, placing the decisions that deputies made about the place of transparency and secrecy in government and the debates that those decisions engendered front and center. So it examines how founders like James Madison, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, how they answered a question that we're still asking today, which is, what does it mean to represent the people in government? How do we do that? It further traces the thinking of French revolutionaries like Jean-Paul Marat, Jacques-Pierre Brissot, and Maximilien Robespierre about the proper relationship between the people and their elected representatives. And most importantly, I take up this task not only by examining what these people wrote in a theoretical capacity, but by dissecting their daily decisions as they attempted to translate their ideas into practices. Now, in my book, I treat practices as constitutive of concepts, trying to push the political and intellectual history of these revolutions beyond the traditional focus on discourse and ideology. And in doing so, I'm making an argument that representative democracy is not merely an idea, but a set of practices that accrue definitional power over time. Okay, so before I delve into this more bounded case study that I want to talk about of the early American Republic, I just want to give you a sense of how the argument kind of unfolds over the course of the book as a whole. So my story really starts in the mid-18th century when secrecy became a common concern in both Anglo and French contexts, linked to fears of conspiracy, corruption, and despotism. And I also want to note heavily gendered female, which is another point of interest. Just to give you all sort of a taste of this, you can see on your left just a cartoon of the British Prime Minister, Lord North. Here he's sitting astride a stream of corruption in Parliament. And on your right is actually my favorite image from all of my research. This is a depiction of the discovery of King Louis XVI's safe in a wall in the palace, a literal skeleton in his closet who has the head of one of the deputies there in the National Convention. Now, English writers and American colonists, they often pointed to the mysterious machinations of the king's ministers, right, as the root of otherwise inexplicable evils they saw coming out of Parliament in the 1760s and 1770s. And you had both French and English reformers who referenced the tightly guarded governance of the Bourbon monarchy in France as characteristic of its despotic sort of tendencies. Enlightenment writers at the time really emphasized the dispelling of darkness and the spread of knowledge as the social project of the age, and they championed emotional authenticity as a cultural value. Now, accompanying the intense suspicion of secrecy were emergent calls for greater publicity in government, particularly in representative institutions. Now, publicity rather than transparency was the term that was most often deployed to sort of connote the opposite of secret. So it had a very kind of spongy definition at the time. It's not very fixed. It signified openness, accessibility, these kind of things. So to be considered representative, writers in England, Anglo-America, and France began to suggest that government needed to be subject to public view in some way. Now, from there, I turn to the revolutionary moment of the creation of the United States and the outbreak of revolution in France to explain how determining the balance of secrecy and transparency in new governments became central to shaping the type of political representation that got practiced in that place. So moving back and forth across the Atlantic, I analyzed decisions about the use of secrecy in representative institutions to help draw distinctions about the way representative democracy was contested and also cemented in practice. So decisions like the one made by the framers to meet in secret while they drafted the Constitution, are focal points for my analysis through the book. When that decision gets compared to the decision of the French Estates General to meet with open doors and an audience 2 years later in 1789, the significance of these practices, I think, becomes all the more apparent. These comparisons are really highlighted with contrasting images like these that I've put up here, which allow me to draw distinctions about the way that representative democracy was conceived of and constructed in these different contexts. So throughout just before I move on, I just want to kind of talk about these. So, here we have a depiction of Philadelphia. It's a few men in a kind of small room, right, in debate. And then over here in Versailles, you have a massive hall, right? You can see there's people, an audience kind of up above there. You even have women on the floor of the assembly. The public is not even necessarily separated, right, from the elected officials. So very different situations here. Now, so I use these to talk about different types of representation and how people thought about it. The first type is what I call insulated representation. It's well depicted by the scene in Philadelphia here. So under this theory, representatives were legitimate because they were chosen, because they were elected. Once they were in office doing their jobs, they were meant to determine the best interests of the people without having to reflect public opinion or face external pressure. This vision necessitated a certain degree of secrecy throughout the deliberative process, which was considered in this sense to have a positive value, provided some insulation for them. Now, the second vision is one that I call reflective representation, which required publicity, right? Publicity was necessary in this vision in order to facilitate the reflection of public opinion throughout the political and deliberative process, even between elections. It's reflected, again, very well in this depiction of the Estates General with the audience and sort of participation of the unelected people in the room. Now, my analysis is driven forward at moments, by moments at which the government's use of secrecy became very central to public debate about the nature of political representation. And I want to turn to one of these moments now in early America, just to give you a sense of how I reached these conclusions about the way in which secrecy was very central to the meaning of representative democracy and to securing its legitimacy. Okay. So I want to highlight one of the key moments I examine in the book, which is the Constitutional Convention, which met in this room here. At the time, a very hot, it's summer in Philadelphia, very hot, and poorly lit room in Philadelphia, in contrast to this good modern lighting, right? When they convened, the men who came there quickly vowed to keep their deliberations strictly amongst themselves. It's one of the first things that they did. Now, precedent certainly afforded one reason why they would have done this. Meeting in secret was not uncommon for a legislative or constituent body in the 18th century. Both the Continental and Confederation Congresses worked behind closed doors. Only 4 state constitutions at that time contained requirements to either publish legislative journals or keep open doors during meetings. And even the House of Commons in England had only recently and very begrudgingly begun allowing reporters to record and publish accounts of their proceedings. Okay, so it's not totally out of the realm of possibility why they would do this, not uncommon. But attitudes about public access were changing at this time. There were 2 provisions that would be included in the Constitution that would address the public reporting of government activity, one requiring a periodic publication of congressional journals, and the other a periodic publication of accounts. And this suggests a sense among those in the room that some degree of publicity would be necessary in the government that they were establishing there. But even in adding those requirements for transparency, the framers still slipped in a caveat, allowing for secrecy at Congress's discretion. So in Article 1, Section 5, they said that each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings and from time to time publish the same, excepting such parts as may in their judgment require secrecy. A pretty big latitude, right? It lets them kind of decide that. So despite this seeming awareness of changing attitudes about the propriety of officials meeting or working in secret, the deputies unanimously decided in Philadelphia to close their doors and to establish a pretty capacious provision allowing for congressional secrecy in the document that they produced. Now, critics of the Constitution, they seized upon the secrecy surrounding the convention as a central critique during the ratification debates. Opponents began to question whether the use of secrecy in a political deliberation was ever legitimate under a representative government. And for many of them, the answer was no, that it was not. Now, the political expediency of them focusing on secrecy as a critique, as a way to generate suspicion in the Constitution, that can't be underestimated, right? I was just talking about how secrecy was creating a lot of anxiety, how there were publicity became sort of a central value, and secrecy was very linked to alleged conspiracies and corruption in England itself. Okay, so we might think they're just doing this because it might be effective. But these critiques of the convention and the Constitution did more than point to secrecy as suspicious. Rather, they articulated a rival political vision in which secrecy was entirely incompatible with representative government. Now, many anti-federalists, as opponents of the Constitution were called, considered political representation as a mirror or microcosm of society, that conception that I was calling reflective representation. So anti-federalists rejected secrecy. They believed that reflective representation required publicity, which would allow for public oversight and facilitate a reflection of public opinion in political decision-making. They advocated for frequent returns of elected officials home, right? More numerous legislatures, shorter terms, smaller districts, all of these kind of things. Anti-federalists tended to agree that representatives should be bound by the people's will, and they believed that this vision needed to be guaranteed by mechanisms that would actually facilitate that in practice. Now, their rejection of secrecy was a significant component of this vision, their commitment to publicity. And it's possible to trace this line of thinking through their attacks on the secrecy used in the Constitutional Convention, which were typically paired with assertions that the body had not been representative of the people because it hindered that proper relationship between the delegates and the people in whose name they wrote the document. So not only would having access to the deliberative process have informed public opinion, as many of them argued, it would have facilitated an active public participation in crafting the product, which for many of them was essential to making it legitimate. In the spring of 1788, a few months after the Constitution was published, someone calling himself a plebeian pointed out in a pamphlet that because the convention's debates remained, quote, an impenetrable secret, no opportunity was given for the well-informed men to offer their sentiments upon the subject. So he sort of went on to argue that now that the Constitution had been published, he said a free discussion had brought to light its defects as well as its strengths. And the author used this to advocate that another convention should then be called, where people could come back based on this open conversation and rework the document. Now, the Constitution was presented on an all or nothing basis. The framers were not interested in inviting another convention, right? They put it out there, they said, take it or leave it. Amendments were not to be considered as part of the process. But many anti-federalists started to argue that deliberating on behalf of the people to produce a document in their name required their input in some kind of meaningful way. Now, this input could not be obtained when the process of deliberation was concealed and only a finished product was then presented for the public to either agree or disagree with. So the debate that emerged over whether amendments should be allowed amounted to a contest over the degree to which the broader public should be involved in the process of lawmaking or constitution making in a representative republic. Now, as early as the fall of 1787, right after the Constitution was published, an acrimonious back and forth emerged on just this question between the anti-federalist Cato, who's writing in the New York Journal, and the federalist Caesar, writing in the New York Daily Advertiser. Now, Cato told readers, he said, teach the members of that convention that you are capable of supervision of their conduct. The same medium that gave you the system, if it is erroneous, while the door is now open, can make amendments or give another if it is required. Okay, so he's saying, let's get in on this conversation. 4 days later, Caesar, on the other side, he retorted that the door was not always open for suggestions and was presently closed, actually, that they didn't want suggestions. And he asked Cato, why did you not offer your expertise while the convention was meeting? At which point, he insinuated the door had been open, right, for alterations. Well, Cato responded very directly by pointing out that, contrary to what Caesar seemed to believe, the door during the meeting of the convention had quite literally been shut, right? He said the convention, too, when in session, shut their doors to the observations of the community, and their members were under an obligation of secrecy, as if nothing transpired, right? To have suggested remarks on unknown and anticipated principles would have been like a man groping in the dark and folly in the extreme, right? So he says it wasn't possible for us to offer these ideas when it was being made. We didn't know what was happening. Now, you have federalists or advocates of the Constitution who, in response to these kind of critiques, defended secrecy's utility in the framing. And despite them doing this, you could see that it was becoming hard for them to do it because the state ratifying conventions almost all met with open doors. And as the people, or more accurately, their representatives in these conventions, met to consider the Constitution and whether they wanted to grant their assent or not, the provisions for secrecy that were in the Constitution alarmed some of these delegates, who worried that a repeat of the Constitutional Convention's procedures would be authorized in the new government they were going to form. Patrick Henry, twice former governor of Virginia, famous utterer of the line, "Give me liberty or give me death," right? He was particularly worried about this. He said, "I appeal to this convention, in Virginia, if it would not be better for America to take off the veil of secrecy." Over the course of the convention, Henry asserted that the people's liberties would be in danger if, quote, the transactions of their rulers were concealed from them. To shield the common routine of business from the public eye was nothing short of an abomination and would lead to the perpetration of wicked and pernicious schemes and iniquitous plots. So it was not only the secrecy of the Constitutional Convention that alarmed anti-federalists like Henry, but a fear that the Constitution had not gone far enough in ensuring that representatives would work in public view in the new federal government. Now, citing the British House of Commons and American state legislatures, James Madison came back and advanced the Federalist position in response, replying that there was not a single government that did not allow for the discretionary concealment of its activity. The Constitution, he asserted, was going further than any existing framework by requiring any publication of proceedings or accounts. And on top of this, he suggested that secrecy would not pose a problem in a representative government, noting that, quote, there can be no real danger as long as the government is constructed on such principles. We might beg to differ with him right today, but he's advancing this kind of argument. We don't have to worry about secrecy in a representative government. Now, this resonated with the reasons that Madison had articulated earlier for the convention itself having met in secret. In a letter that he wrote to Thomas Jefferson back at the beginning of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Madison explained the reason for keeping the proceedings closed. He said it was thought expedient in order to secure unbiased discussion within doors and to prevent misconceptions and misconstructions without, to establish some rules of caution which will for no short time restrain even a confidential communication of our proceedings. So in this articulation of an ideal relationship between these delegates and the public, these representatives of the people could not perform their duty without the necessary insulation that was provided by secrecy in the room. And we should remember that at the time, the case for secrecy was not just defensive, right? He's writing this before the Anti-Federalists have attacked the secrecy. Framers like Madison were also out making a positive case for it, the value add that they thought that it had to the representative process. And I just want to highlight this point. I often do this with my students, and I think it's useful to think about. If today there was a new constitutional convention, which is not impossible at all, by the way, if there was, and it were held and every aspect of that was on cable TV 24/7, on social media all the time, would anything get done, right? Okay, a lot of my students say, no, I don't think anything would get done. On the other hand, if it was completely shut, do you think people would accept that? Probably not, right? So it's a very, it's kind of a catch-22, difficult situation. Madison certainly thought, even back in the 18th century, before modern communication technology, that if the doors were open throughout the process, that nothing would have gotten done. And he thought this, right, even in 1787. Decades after the original convention, he noted that without secrecy, no framework would have been agreed upon. So in short, Madison thought that without secrecy, there would be no constitution. Now, I think it's worth pausing to consider the extent to which Madison might have been right about the convention's deliberations being kept secret, both at the time, during ratification, and long afterward. So in the immediate aftermath of the convention, the fact that what had happened inside the room was not widely known did allow for malleability, to put it kindly maybe, in addressing the intentions behind and implications of some of the provisions in the Constitution. Now, there are numerous examples of this, but maybe the most consequential was about the institution of slavery. Because it was not clear how the clauses related to slavery were crafted, you had both pro and anti-slavery delegates who could return home and report that they had done what was possible, right, within the given constraints that they faced, and that the document either protected the institution or laid the foundation for its eventual elimination. Now, the secrecy of the deliberations allows debates about the place of slavery in the American Constitution to endure to this day, right, where it plays out in op-eds as well as in scholarship and just kind of the broader public. So the uncertainty stemming from the fundamentally obscure origins of the clause defining enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, among other provisions, enables a multiplicity of interpretations. Right? So you have some historians, notably David Walstreicher, who've interpreted the use of secrecy as a way that the framers attempted to absolve themselves of guilt or obscure what was in reality a deliberate or at least aware protection of the institution of slavery. And then you have others, most notably recently Sean Wilentz, who suggested that the secrecy surrounding the convention's deliberations actually obscures the concessions that were exacted from Southern delegates and a deliberate fight to prevent defining enslaved people as property in the Constitution. Okay, so you have two radically different interpretations, and that's possible because of the secrecy surrounding these deliberations. So the origins of the wording, right, were for so long concealed, and even now they can only be pieced together with the limited and problematic sources available from the convention. And because of that, I argue that it remains hard to definitively settle the fundamental question of slavery's place in the Constitution, or for that matter, many other parts of the Constitution. Okay, but I want to quickly, just to kind of wrap up this case study, turn from the effects back to the motivations, right, behind this commitment to meeting in secret. So Madison, who I was quoting writing to Jefferson about this, he came to the convention with concerns about what many at the time called an excess of democracy in state legislatures, where debt relief measures had frequently been passed and paper money issued in response to popular pressure. Now, here, it's important to note that for the framers, democracy is often used at the time to connote direct participation by the population in political decision-making. So it called to mind ancient Greece. It was often considered kind of dangerous, unstable, generally impossible to implement in modern society in the 18th century. Now, for Madison, as for many others who were in the room in Philadelphia, democracy was not a solution to the problems they were facing. It was a problem they thought they were facing. Now, whether Madison fundamentally distrusted democracy or not, it's unquestionable that one of his aims was to stabilize political representation as a durable form of Republican government, of popular sovereignty. As he outlined in the Federalist 10, Madison explicitly stated that a republic could avoid the pitfalls of democracy by refining public views through representative institutions. Now, he also argued that a large republic, right, an extended republic, could endure where others had failed by enlarging the political sphere to elicit the election of what he called fit characters, who would have enough distance from popular pressure and factional interests to make sound decisions on behalf of the nation. Shielding the details of political deliberation from public view, along with increasing the size and sort of number of electoral districts, aligned with this vision that he had of political representation. So to put it kind of simply, Federalists rejected generally publicity. They believed in that style of insulated representation, which was aided by the use of secrecy in order to create that distance and to allow representatives to deliberate without facing external pressure. Insulated representation meant that representatives were made legitimate at the moment of election or selection, and after that they were meant to determine the best interests of the people without having to bend to external influence or worry too much about figuring out what that was. Secrecy became another crucial way to create distance to allow for legislative decision-making without ongoing pressure from the unelected public. So Madison has this theory. He's articulating this theory in the Federalist Papers, but he's a very interesting figure to follow because a few years later, he appears to have changed his mind about secrecy, and some scholars have argued about democracy. So essentially, Madison kind of shifted from this Federalist understanding of insulated representation to a more anti-Federalist understanding of reflective representation. And his thinking about secrecy evolved accordingly. Throughout the 1790s, he would generally support the open doors of the House of Representatives. He'd play an instrumental role in founding an opposition newspaper. He published essays advocating an active role for public opinion in what he called a free government. And we might ask, like, what accounts for Madison's changed mind? How does he kind of change his view on secrecy and transparency and what it means? The short answer is this guy, right? Someone he does not like, Alexander Hamilton, whose proposed policies to create a national bank, right, take on federal debt, promote domestic manufacturing, and sort of pursue rapprochement with Great Britain, led former anti-federalists and some who had supported ratification very vehemently, like Madison and Jefferson, to kind of come together and form a new alliance. But while the policies that Hamilton was advancing certainly alarmed them, their focus quickly became the process by which these policies were advanced, specifically the use of secrecy. Concerns about secrecy were very central to the factional realignments that took place in the early republic and to the formation of the first kind of protean political parties in the US. I don't have time, not going to take that story forward today into the 1790s, but my book does this, tracing these debates up through the election of Thomas Jefferson as president in 1800. So in all, I conclude that secrecy was used deliberately during the early republic to render public opinion marginal to the foundational legitimacy of representative democracy in America. Okay, big claim, I know. So I'm looking forward to everyone taking me on that in the Q&A. All right, so by placing the American story in an Atlantic framework, I think it can help us to see just how important these procedural decisions about the use of secrecy in government really were. So while George Washington often noted the benefits of working behind the curtain, as he put it, this was not a common sentiment in the French Assembly convened in 1789 to advise the king on financial reform, the Estates General. When a deputy there suggested barring the public from their deliberations, he was met with downright disdain. He said, you know, have you forgotten that you are all but their representatives, their proxies, and you dare remove yourselves from their gaze when you owe them an account of all your work, all your thoughts? I cannot respect he who seeks to hide himself in the shadows. The grand day is made to shed light on the truth, and I am proud to think like the philosopher who said that all his actions never had anything secret, and that he wished his house was made of glass. Now, this commitment to transparency undermined the legitimacy of French representatives as voices of the people in cases where public opinion did not seem to align with the deputies' decisions, which were increasingly common as the Revolution wore on. So while you had the American government opening up more to public view as time went on, the French National Assemblies trended in the opposite direction, actually closing more off from public view over time. But just to return to these images that I started with, the decisions made at the moment of founding of these governments had a lasting impact on the way that representative democracy was defined and understood in these countries. In navigating that tension between that Enlightenment imperative to eradicate secrets from the state and a practical need to limit the extent of transparency or publicity in government, revolutionaries in the United States and France determined the character and durability of representative regimes. In both contexts, secrecy, in the sense of limiting the public's view of government work, was strategically deployed and defended to advance a vision of political representation as legitimated solely in the moment of election, rather than an ongoing reflection of public opinion. Now, on the other hand, you had pushes for publicity in government that kept an alternate theory of political representation alive, contesting the legitimacy of newly created governments as voices of the people on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, though my work is partly a work of comparative history, I'm not primarily interested in explaining the different courses of the French and American revolutions. Instead, I try to treat them together as contemporaries themselves often thought of them in order to explain both the unique aspects of each and the emergence of what we now call representative democracy. Now, by using decisions and debates about secrecy and transparency in government as a lens to understand the invention and evolution of representative democracy, my book explains how transparency became a cornerstone of modern democracies and the way in which state secrecy was deemed dangerous despite its use in this period. Now, these are connotations that we live with today, and they're a direct result of the transformation in thinking that took place in the latter half of the 18th century. So the question of what can legitimately be kept secret in a republic, in a representative government, remains at the heart of contests over the meaning and practice of representative politics to this day. I just gathered a few examples of this. There are more and more recent ones, but thinking about classified documents, finding them in presidents' houses in different situations, these kind of questions. Back in 2016, organizations like WikiLeaks, right, hacking and exposing the emails of politicians, arguing that they should be transparent or that they reveal inauthenticity. During the first Trump term, questions about the impeachment hearings and what should be public and not, whether voting in the Senate should be public or not. And then I just have an image of the Supreme Court, a branch I haven't talked about a lot today, but when the Dobbs decision was leaked before it was actually issued, that raised a whole host of questions about, what should the public be able to see in the process of Supreme Court decisions. So these questions saturate our politics today. And as these debates intensify, political scientists tend to consistently tie this question back to the meaning of democracy itself. Now, as a work of history, my research is not aimed at producing a policy prescription or settling the question of whether secrecy promotes or diminishes democracy. Instead, I want to explain how, why, and with what effect the question of state secrecy was linked to the meaning of representative democracy in the first place. Right? Attitudes about state secrecy and transparency, like understandings of representative democracy, are not ahistorical. They've been shaped in different contexts over time. And in the modern world, we largely still live within the discursive and even institutional frameworks established in the 18th century, which I think should prompt a thorough investigation into their construction. So understanding the way that debates over secrecy and transparency played out at the foundation of modern representative democracy, I think is essential to clarifying their stakes today. Thank you again. I really look forward to your questions.
Okay, can we hear this still? Can we hear this still?
I'm gonna bet yes.
Okay. So yes, thanks to Caitlin. We have plenty of time for questions, and our usual way of going about this is to ask the first question to be from a student. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. When the anti-federalists spoke of opening the doors to public participation in the events, who to them constituted the public? Was it just the politically enfranchised class, or did they have a broader sense of who should be involved?
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is something I really wrestled with in writing this book, and in the book, I'm able to delve a lot more into. A lot of this relates to that question of who is the public. And everyone involved has a very different conception of who that public is, which is part of the challenge. I think we're still having that challenge today. So for anti-federalists, often they are thinking themselves, right? Me. I should have been in the room. They often reference like learned or informed men, right? So they obviously have a narrow conception. But what I try to bring out through the book is that a commitment to publicity or transparency does create possibilities for a broader public to become or to come into being or assert itself. For example, having the House of Representatives open to an audience, or in France, the National Assembly, a lot of the audience is made up of women. And these are, of course, people who are formally disenfranchised in these systems, but they are able to have a presence in these spaces once they're open to public audiences. And so it can have these effects of kind of extending the meaning of the public, while at the same time can also have a sense of legitimizing their formal exclusion by saying, well, they can see, right, but they can't speak. So I try to also deal with that. It has a kind of some radical potential in enlarging the public, but then it can also serve to reinforce a more exclusionary public of who is actually enfranchised in the system. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for this. I think my question might go nicely from what you were just talking about. I'm really interested in thinking through how intimate relationships and households might fit in here. So like when I think of the issues that you're describing, I'm wondering, to what extent are the people in the story sitting with their wives at the kitchen table, or their servants are around, their enslaved people might be around. Yeah. And to what extent, does this kind of just intimate relationship of who's in your household serve as a kind of, exception, perhaps in certain ways of this idea of secrecy. People tend to talk to the people who live in their household, and influence can happen that way too, where wives aren't necessarily in the room, but they're very much kind of part of that conversation. Of course, these, the records of this would not be published in the same way, accessible in the same way, but how might we imagine those kinds of possibilities?
Yeah, thank you for this question. That's very important. So one thing that I found really interesting, like during the Revolutionary War, for example, John Adams is at the beginning in the Continental Congress. They imposed rules of secrecy, and he still writes to Abigail, right? Yeah. And he still tells her stuff, and it's sort of like carved out as this exception. Well, you mean like it's secret in the formal realm, but she's like an extension of me. She's part of my family unit, so I'll still speak to her freely. And he changes that as things go on, as there's more interception of letters. He feels he has to be more cautious about that. But often you see politicians, they're still writing things or speaking to their wives, and they're not really thinking about that as a violation of secrecy. So absolutely, that does kind of present interesting sort of thinking about how they're creating the bounds of that. And the other thing to note is that there is thought about spaces where political discussion is happening. And one example that I find really interesting is once Thomas Jefferson comes into the White House, he is very particular about having only deaf servants and enslaved people working around dinner tables, for example. Like there's a real concern about that and like a commitment to that level. So there is also an awareness about where things get picked up in informal settings, and you can see different presidents or different politicians at different times having different levels of how they're thinking about that. Thanks.
Thanks. This was a really great talk. I really enjoyed all of it. My question is, I'm wondering where the problem of secrecy fits in with the problem of the passivity of the people as like a democratic problem. Yeah. And I think there's a number of ways it could possibly go, but this is why I thought this. Watching this great comparison of the French and the American models made me think of Arendt's own discourse on the French and American revolutions. Yeah. She ends with this haunting line where she says, perhaps the founding fathers came to understand that the greatest freedom of all, and I think she's joking here, was the freedom from politics, that people generally wouldn't want to be burdened by politics, and they created this wonderful system where people wouldn't have to be burdened. And I guess the question I have for you is, like, were the founders worried about secrecy because sometimes it's framed almost like, oh, well, the people, they would be so invested and involved and, you know, nipping at our heels and we wouldn't be able to get things done, right? But is the secrecy also a demobilizing kind of argument? And then if it is there a recognition on the part of the founders, like, is Arendt right? Like, did they see this in human nature, or were they trying to create a human nature that was like this? If that makes sense.
Yeah, great question. I think what I'm trying to argue in the book is that I think that many of the framers, early American politicians, saw secrecy as a useful tool to push the people back, right? To create that insulated space. I'm not saying they did this for nefarious purposes necessarily. I mean, sure, in a lot of moments it's strategic, right? You know you're going to do something unpopular. You don't want people breathing down your neck on that. Sure. But I do think there was overall, especially among Federalists, and I'm talking Federalists of the Constitution, but also into the 1790s political party, I think there was a sense that this could be positive, that what this could do is actually make better decision making by removing that constant sense of the public gaze or kind of pressure to do what's popular. And I think they had like a commitment to that. I think we can very much debate whether that's anti-democratic. I think in many ways it is. But I'm trying to recover in the book that there was a positive case for that, and that that we shouldn't dismiss that entirely as this is anti-democratic and bad. At the same time, I do think it was intentionally anti-democratic in certain ways. Yes, but this question of passivity that you raise, something that I came to also as I was writing the book is to also think about the ways in which transparency leads to a passive citizenry. And I try to trace, and by the end of the book, I think I get to a point to say that it can be that once publicity becomes implemented, it quickly turns to spectatorship, where it's not this active dialogue that many advocates of it, envision. It's like, okay, like I was talking about women in the audience, okay, you can watch. It's not a feedback though, it's like, it's almost a performance, right? And I think that there's really good work by political philosophers about this today in our modern world as transparency has become ever more of a guiding principle and ever more possible, some might argue with new technologies, that it is actually making citizens more passive because it's almost like a balm that makes us feel like, okay, it's okay because we can see what's going on, but actually maybe it's not, right? Like just seeing is not enough. So I think that, yeah, it's really interesting dynamics there. Yeah.
This is all really interesting, and you did mention in your talk briefly, it's like when you give to your students, like, could anything happen if you with cameras in the room and all that, and I've been really intrigued by arguments that cameras in like C-SPAN, and that's actually thwarting the legislative process, and it's a really important reason why Congress has become so dysfunctional. And in some ways, I hear a kind of anticipation of that in your discussion of the 18th century. And then you raised this in your talk, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, you can read it as sort of an anticipation of some of the ills that people describe coming out of like greater transparency. So a lot of American politicians and especially French politicians voice many concerns in the 1790s about the performativity of politics. And they're sort of like, well, when there's an audience in the room, the speaker's just speaking to the audience, trying to get applause, trying to make sure that what they say gets out in the newspapers, trying to build a name for themselves. And of course, political fame, the idea of like celebrity is also really coming into play in this period. And I don't think that's coincidental that it's at the same time that these legislatures are opening up. So yes, there are a lot of people at the time who are very concerned about the effect of that on politics. The other thing that I would just note, and I think that those concerns are true. But on the other hand, I'm not saying that it's better to like do everything under cover of darkness. I think that that's kind of the challenge, is like finding a balance between those things. The other thing that I just wanted to note quickly when you brought up C-SPAN, anyone who's watched C-SPAN, and I don't think we often do that, right? But because it's often like a guy with some bad visuals speaking to an empty room, right? So there's a way in which also when doors get open to certain spaces, like the real work moves to other spaces where it's not public anymore. And again, I think we see this dynamic like already in the 18th century, like when they opened the house to an audience, okay, well, suddenly a lot of work moves to committee, right? It gets moved to other spaces and informal spaces. So that's something that I think is also important to think about. Like, generally, we might think about, oh, there's more transparency of Congress, right? But then you think about where does the actual work happen, often not in these public spaces. And so there's a way in which you can trace more transparency, but is it meaningful or not? I think that's questionable. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. Speaking of C-SPAN, I always am struck by like they talk about like when they do committee hearings or they film the committees, and I think to myself, like they know they're on TV a lot of the time, and I often wonder that might play a part of what they say or ask questions and all of that.
Yeah.
And there was something about the Supreme Court nominations that really kind of showed up, and it was Robert Bork's nomination that was brought up back in 1987 that this was brought up a lot, and how it swayed public opinion against him pretty significantly in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And do you think that having these broadcasts so much can do damage to the political process, whether it's right or wrong?
Yeah, I think this is really hard. So I'm going to give you like a non-answer. As a historian, I won't say if it's right or wrong. I don't know. I think it's really hard. And I think that depends on what we want democracy to mean and be. So often I think it tends to get, it depends on what side you're on in any given political battle, right? People kind of make that determination how it suits them. I mean, you can see a lot of accusations of Congress like passing bills late on a Friday night or something. And you see that on both sides, like the other side will say, oh, they intentionally did this, at night because it's not popular and they know it. So those accusations, people flip on that, right? Depending on if they agree or not with the policy that comes out of it. But what I'm trying to recover is kind of exactly that point, that those decisions matter, and that they really do have implications for like how democracy functions, and that having televised hearings, it has benefits, right? It does allow the public to know what's going on, to learn more about, candidates for these positions, to have those people questioned publicly, and that has immense value, right? It also has drawbacks, as you note, in other ways. In many ways, these are performances, right? They are pieces of political theater. People in the room know that, right? Elected officials know that. And I'm interested too, in the 18th century, this is the first time where I think we can see elected officials developing that awareness of like what I say is going to be known by people. And then I think that does significantly change the way that you engage in political deliberation in a legislative body. So yeah, I won't say whether I think it's good or bad. I think it just really depends on what we think is good or bad, or like what we want out of our democracy. But I do think it does cut to the heart of that, and that there are advantages and disadvantages that we don't always consider. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. So I wanted to ask a bit more about the origins of this differentiation between reflected and insulated.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, from your point of view, how much this has to do with being reactions to what was happening in the mid-18th century. So, right, like quite often when you have French and you have British officials getting together, they go on and on about, France, it's censored, it's insulated, no one knows everything, it's always secret, secret, secret.
Yeah.
And everything is made public in the British context. Of course, that's not exactly what's going on in the world, but it's the sort of exchanges you can see between like Rouillet, Robinson, all these sorts of people. And so I'm wondering if where this comes into play, where in a British American or now, newly independent American context, they're coming out of both an awareness of this idea in the British context, right? Things have always been made public, and that can be bad because the public can weigh in on whether you go to war, it can weigh in on all sorts of different decisions. And more importantly, we just took advantage of that, right? Like these British colonists or former British colonists, what did they do, right? They usurped or rejected British imperial rule by swaying public opinion.
Yeah.
And whereas in the French case, right, it's like deep, deep secrecy. Of course, there's a relaxation beforehand, but I'm just wondering, like, is this just kind of knee-jerk reactions to what preceded, or is there something more going on? Because I think when you walk us through the American one, it seems much more complicated to me than what I think is the simplistic version I'm getting at.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think in some ways there is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. So like in France, it's not surprising that they're very committed to working in public. And it is partly because there's this massive backlash to the Bourbon monarchy, which, as you note, had just long been characterized as like this despotic, secretive, group, man with his ministers, right, making these decisions. And so there is just this like reaction against that. For the deputies to have met in secret, I think would have been basically impossible in 1789. There's just a complete rejection of that. They're also, unlike the Americans writing their constitution, they're doing this where there's still a king, right? And so they also know, they feel like transparency is protection for them, right? If people know what they're doing, the king can't just shut them down, which he tries to do, and he tries to say there can't be an audience. And they really fight that, and they view it as kind of protecting them. Now, in the American case, that's just totally different, right? When they're writing their constitution, there is not a king they're contending with. Transparency would not help them or protect them in what they're doing. And I think in part that is kind of, as you note, a little bit of a backlash to the British system, which I think Americans do perceive as secretive. And I actually think part of even though there is this trope, right, that it's very open in comparison to France. But for the Americans, for the colonists at least, I think they do still find it like very corrupt and secretive. And I think part of the reason is distance. And I think that's also, the question of distance and time is so central to how they're thinking about this. And so I think when the revolution starts, part of the push for publicity is also like a backlash to that. Like we want to be close, right? We want to be able to like see our elected officials, talk to them, have this feedback loop. And I think by the time you have deputies going to Philadelphia after the revolution, after the 1780s, they're now like, we've gone too far with that. Like we need to go. So I think it is part of that narrative of kind of some backlash to the revolution and sort of this idea that maybe we've gone too far in that direction and we need to bring back a little bit more of that insulation. And then I think what you see playing out over the 1790s is like these kind of, factions. Some think that we've gone too far then in that direction, like Madison comes to think that, I think. And then others think, no, we haven't gone far enough, right? Like we need to insulate this more. So yeah, I think you're right that it's maybe seems a little more complicated to understand in the American context, where they're working without a king. But I do think it's kind of that backlash to their own revolutionary situation.
Hi. I was just wondering, do you feel that political transparency has affected the personal morals of the public, like of people individually today, by shaping our understanding of the society that we're living in? And adding on to that, if secrecy had been maintained throughout history and transparency didn't become a central value in America, do you feel that the personal morals and values of the public would have been impacted by that as well? Do you think we would be like in a different place morally as a society?
Wow.
Sorry, I said that all in one breath. I
No. Wow, that's a really profound question. I don't know. I mean, I know that that's a cop-out, but I do think that what I'm arguing with my work is that it really does matter, and I do think it has a huge impact on like the way that we think about democracy, the way we conceive of a citizen's like role in a representative government, the way that representatives think about their role or obligations to the people. And I do think that in terms of like what's done behind closed doors versus what is public, I do think that those decisions really shape how we think about a lot of those things. So yes, I think if Congress had never opened its doors or published journals, I think we'd live in a very, very different society. In terms of people's like moral composition or outlook? I don't know. I imagine probably yes, it would change the way that is, but I don't know. I do think it would have a big effect. I think we'd be living in a very different polity and society if things had been different. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Could you give a, I know Billy has said that your current project is the politics of truth. Can you give us an idea, because I imagine that this book and your newest project probably in many ways is a conversation with each other. Can you give us an idea of your initial thoughts right now of what is the politics of truth?
Yeah, well, yeah, a question we're all desperately asking. Yeah, I'm working now on a project about truth in politics in early America. It very much comes out of this work. I basically started to think about, okay, once doors are open to these spaces and public opinion is made, central to government and how it functions, it raises all of these questions about what is the relationship between opinion and facts or truth? How, if you're going to base your decisions in government on public opinion, does it matter if that opinion is based on truth or not? Can it be right or wrong? Kind of all these questions. So I'm looking at how early Americans thought about these questions and ways that they tried to devise to promote or guarantee truth in the public sphere. So things like the development of shorthand to report legislative deliberations and try to create accurate records of them and sort of the challenges inherent in that. Sedition laws and sort of thinking behind those in terms of how truth could or could not be guaranteed or refereed in this kind of system. Yeah, so those are kind of the questions I'm interested in. I mean, short answer, it's really messy. We still haven't really figured these things out, but I'm interested in looking at how early Americans, as they're forming this type of government,